You can have them on or off. It doesn't matter. Andrina, I just want to make people aware of the fact that I will be recording the session, if that's okay. And really, if there are any questions as we go along, if people want to raise their hand, just yeah, and please do feel free to stop me. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a million for joining me this afternoon. My name is Dr. Deirdre Goggin, and I work in Munster Technological University in recognition of prior learning and work-based learning as part of the MTU Extended Campus. And I suppose this afternoon, this event is part of the Cork Lifelong Learning Festival. We're very excited to be part of that and also to disseminate the outcomes of this Erasmus Plus project that we were involved in for the last 3 years. So I trust that you can all see my slides, and really the slides are for my benefit to keep me on track and to keep me focused, because for me this is it's a fascinating area, and because it provides so many opportunities for so many learners, but also so the focus of this project was about making your courses count or making your learning count, about aligning more specifically adult non-formal education or learning with the ECTS principles. And so really for us in formal education, the ECTS is a common language for describing learning. And those in formal education, I think we all are very familiar with it. We have grown up with it, and so it is something that we're used to working with and within. This project, was the origins of it came from the non-formal adult education sector, and the partners of the project, along with Munster Technological University, they do a lot of very worthwhile work with those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, migrants, refugees, those who are who really haven't had the best experiences maybe with formal education, and they're trying to avail of opportunities to enhance their knowledge and skills for employment or future learning opportunities. So the providers really are very conscious about how they structure and describe the training that they do with these individuals to ensure that it maximizes the opportunity for people in the future. So as I said, it was a 3-year project, and so I'm going to bring you through the learning that we gained of the project, of partners over the 3 years. So I suppose looking at the context and the need of the project, so as we're all very aware, there's valuable learning gained through non-formal adult education. It isn't as maybe structured as formal education, but it is so worthwhile in terms of the focus and the opportunity that it gives individuals maybe who are newly arrived to different jurisdictions, maybe with very little formal education or opportunity that has been given to them so far, and they are looking for integration opportunities. So, for us within the project, we were very clear that non-formal adult education across Europe delivers valuable learning experiences, and it equips adults with those essential skills for personal and professional development. And these programs address diverse needs, from digital literacy to employability skills, serving learners from all backgrounds. So it's not just tailored for one particular type of learner, it really is to address the needs of anyone who actually engages with these non-formal adult education providers. I suppose the challenge that the partners of this project find is that in terms of communicating the learning outcomes or what is being gained through these education opportunities or training opportunities, so communicating what has been achieved, the workload, how much effort, learner effort has been involved, the assessment evidence, so that it is easy for those external stakeholders, such as those in the workplace or in other education or just society in general, to understand and compare as to what one has achieved and maybe another who has achieved something different. And so what happens is that this creates barriers for learners when they seek to articulate or explain the achievements that they have in contexts where recognition routes exist. So either as for the partners of this project, it is within the context of, say, employment. So articulating the skill set that people have achieved, but also for education, maybe into vocational education or further education and training, or potentially higher education in the future. But it is when there isn't, I suppose, a descriptor or description of what has been done and covered and successfully achieved, then it is difficult for them to articulate that. And so, communicating what has been achieved by individuals through a non-formal adult education course, that this was the focus of those providers, because for themselves, not all of them have been using or developing descriptions of what the purpose and intention of the training is. And for many, they were developing courses ad hoc depending on the learner cohort that were sitting in front of them. So they identified that need as being paramount, that how do you communicate and ensure that it is understandable? And then in terms of transparency, that there's a need for a common language that could describe the value and the complexity of non-formal learning without compromising its learner-centered, flexible nature. And that is the beauty of non-formal adult education, is that, it meets learners at the most appropriate point. But there is also a need to ensure that they are giving them something that's useful and maybe transferable into a future context. And they felt that transparency or the descriptors would better support understanding amongst employers, formal education providers, and learners themselves as to what they had achieved through non-formal adult education. So I suppose for us, the question then, or the question for the project was, how could non-formal adult education providers better communicate the value, the complexity and achievement of their courses to external stakeholders? And the answer that we came up was to develop a practical methodology using the ECTS principles as a common language of description and alignment. And I suppose just to emphasize, like, the ECTS and the ECTS guide is very much, present. It exists. It supports formal education, but I suppose for the non-formal adult education providers, they required kind of maybe an earlier step or an earlier version so that they could understand and develop something that kind of comes along the way to the ECTS. But they had a lot of, I suppose, challenges because it's not something that they are familiar with. So it was like, I won't say a translation guide, but it really was more a step-by-step guide as to how they could use, say, the structures of ECTS without, needing the formality of ECTS, because they weren't seeking to become formal education providers where they would be granting ECTS credits or anything like that. It really was about structure and design and making core decisions as to really what was the purpose and intention of the education and training that they were offering individuals. So just the partnership, and there were 6 organizations involved in the partnership. 5 of them were non-formal adult education providers from Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Romania. And then MTU was a higher education provider, but we were the formal education, I suppose, partner, familiar with ECTS and maybe the structuring education in terms of learning outcomes. How do you identify and explain workload, assessment, and how do you ensure that there's appropriate assessment, avoiding over assessment. So all of those kind of discussions as well. But the 5 partners who are engaged in the non-formal adult education, and they're listed here, so they all engage with different learner groups. So for instance, in Syracuse in Italy, the Fondazione Siamo Mediterraneo, they engage with migrants and vulnerable groups in Sicily, normally newly arrived refugees. So they're looking at, integrating them into the locale, familiarity with, say, legal requirements and so other challenges that migrants and refugees have. But they also are engaged in ensuring that they give them valuable skills that can be transferred into enabling them to work or to integrate further into the Italian culture and system. So they were very, very different in who they were working with, from say children or young mothers or young adults who were at risk of social exclusion. So it wasn't just one size, I suppose, really. And that was very interesting as well in terms of the type of people they were reaching, the profile of those individuals as well. So in terms of the methodology, then there were real core decisions that needed to be made. So what we set out to do was to develop a practical methodology to align how non-formal adult education courses are planned, described, delivered, and assessed. And I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the non-formal adult education courses were not necessarily planned in a consistent way. As I said, they looked at the learner group that decided to engage in a particular course, and then they would design the curriculum accordingly. So in terms of the activities or what they were going to focus on, it was always determined by the learner group who were sitting in front of them at that time. So there was no real, I suppose, learning outcomes or what was the purpose and intention of the training. And so that was a new departure for some of the partners. In terms of describing, again, the teachers or the tutors were describing or developing on the fly in terms of how they were describing what the purpose and intention of the course was going to be. And it would vary within the organization. And so again, in the early discussions of the project, it was to emphasize the importance really to try and develop a consistency in terms of, say, those who are young adults, who were experiencing social inclusion and huge challenges, that to develop something that would be useful but consistent in terms of the learning outcomes, the intention, the purpose. But the intention wasn't to replace the good work that non-formal adult education providers were doing or are doing. It really was to give them opportunities as to where they saw that there was a need for this description and planning, that they would implement it rather than transforming what they did already. How it was delivered as well, you know, what ways or methodologies did they use? How do they engage learners? What do they feel that works or doesn't work? And then again, assessment, that for a lot of the providers, they weren't engaged in assessing the learning or capturing whether somebody has successfully achieved, say, the intention, the learning outcomes of the course. So but they identified, the non-formal adult education providers identified, that these would be positive steps for some of the courses that they offer. So once the methodology was developed, then it was tested across the 5 non-formal adult education providers in the diverse European contexts. And that returned several feedbacks and reflections that would enhance then the methodology to ensure that it was fit for purpose and that it could be implemented and it was relevant for non-formal adult education providers who were interested in maybe structuring some parts of their non-formal adult education into this format. And as I said, it really was about, how they plan, they describe, they deliver, and they assess. And then the toolkit was disseminated across the 5 providers and within those 4 countries. So to other providers of non-formal adult education to get their feedback and response. So as I said, the core principles of the approach was to respect non-formal adult education's unique character. And for us in M2, we were very conscious of this, that we didn't want to be formalizing the non-formal adult education sector, because it's important that, that it's got massive value for individuals, especially those who maybe haven't had positive experiences with formal education. But really it was about ensuring that what was being done, was visible to those external, that, it supports the articulation possibilities. So making it easier to evidence where recognition routes exist. So if somebody needs something to get a job within a particular sector and they had done training through a non-formal provider, that it was very clear as to the fact that they had that skill set, or if it was to move on to other education, that it was clear, what level maybe roughly was that person at in terms of knowledge, skill and competence, looking at the opportunities for progression, building on what they have. And I suppose that would be the core principles of the recognition of prior learning, that you're recognizing people's prior learning and entering them at a point most appropriate, so they're not having to repeat what they already know. And that's hugely empowering and motivating for individuals. To improve transparency, so making learning outcomes, workload and assessment easier to understand and compare. So if you're looking at, say, for us, and I'm conscious that there are a lot of people here who are maybe more familiar with prior or formal education maybe than non-formal or informal learning, but that it is important that people would be able to see, well, where does this actually fit? Maybe where does it vary? What are the gaps? What needs to be filled? So again, it's all positivity and supporting the learners, especially those in the case of this project, those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and maybe feeling that they have been forgotten within our society. And then building on the ECTS principles, again, using the learning outcomes, like structuring, describing the learning that someone should have by the end of a learning period, workload estimation and assessment evidence, and for those to be realistic as well in terms of the circumstances that a lot of these individuals would find themselves in. And, the benefit really for us, and I've already touched on it, but about that, the recognition of the learning that they have gained to bridge the opportunities for the future. So the project was over 30 months, and a lot of the work, I suppose, went into the early development, but then the piloting and the refinement of the methodology to ensure that it was usable by those within the non-formal adult education sector. I suppose as a partner of informal education, sometimes we assume that things are very straightforward and self-explanatory because of the familiarity that we might have. But for us, it did highlight, the importance of those descriptions, but also the workload, and capturing the total workload. There was a lot of discussion on that, and where there needs to be additional explanations to ensure that there was that consistent understanding. So the key project results, I suppose the main output has been this methodological guide, and for me, if it's called a methodological guide, but it really is the A to Z of an approach for non-formal adult education providers to structure, to make explicit exactly what is the intention of the learning that they're encouraging people to engage with. It provides templates, worksheets, so a how-to guide really, step by step, for non-formal adult education courses, providers, staff, to move, I won't say or adopt ECTS, but the principles of ECTS, which I've mentioned already. And this output has very much been supported by or through the pilot implementation across the 5 adult education centres who have their own circumstances and challenging, I suppose, environments that they also function within. So the focus was on practicality and adaptability to each of the individual contexts and beyond. And also the training activities for staff within these centres and within the sector, so that they can also apply the methodology if it is something that they feel would be worthwhile to maybe some aspect of the training that they are doing with those who are seeking opportunities. The methodology was also consulted with 160 directors across the non-formal organisations, and they were trained in the methodology. Adult educators, so key people really who can advise as to whether this is realistic, whether it's useful, whether it's usable, transferable again into the different contexts, and also it was highlighted to 80 policymakers from across the consortium countries to ensure that it has relevance and the importance of it, I suppose, as well, for the non-formal adult education sector, for the educators, but also for the individuals and the learners, because they are the beneficiaries of the non-formal adult education. But it highlighted, I think, for a lot of the providers, especially of non-formal adult education, the importance of, sitting down and ensuring that they know or understand the learner cohort. What is the aim of the education or learning that an individual will be undertaking? What are they going to get after it? And making that explicit so that everybody within a centre understands it, but also the learners and those external also understand it. So just looking at breaking down the methodological guide, and this is available, there's a link at the end of the presentation, and it'll give you more detail about the guide, and it's openly available to anyone to use. And really it's about that describing. How do you describe? And maybe for many of us, we feel, well, how hard could that be? But I think for all of us, we have grappled with how do you describe the learning that somebody is maybe undertaking? Are we ensuring that description captures exactly what the purpose and intention is? So the, I suppose the guide is divided into 5 sections, and they're listed here, understanding the approach, why we're doing it and what we were trying to achieve. The methodology was broken down into 6 steps. So a how-to guide as to applying the non-formal adult education approach, to look at good practices and case studies from pilots, ensuring quality and impact, and the toolkit, then the templates and resources that are openly available to everybody. And the toolkit contents include a course descriptor, a learning outcomes builder, an assessment mapper and rubrics, a course evaluation template, the learner profile template, and for a lot of the providers, that was one of the core templates that they found useful, was the learner profile template, to understand like who generally is your learner. Because as I said, a lot of them were looking very much at individuals and trying to determine a course that would meet all those individuals, but that changed on a cyclical basis. Looking at the workload calculator, so the total the learner effort to achieve the learning outcomes. The certificate template, so certificate of completion, it's not a formal certificate. And then, familiarity with EQF, so not trying to, I suppose, circumvent the whole formal process, but understanding the existence of qualification frameworks and where does a learner sit on frameworks, where do they sit now, where are they trying to get to in the future, and ensuring that courses that are designed and developed, take account of where people's starting point is and maybe their ability to achieve the next level. So, again, that was an area of huge learning for some providers, because they were looking at learners where they are now, but possibly trying to get them to a level that was more advanced than where their starting point is or where their abilities lay. So, that was a very interesting part of the project. But again, the awareness of the 3 pillars of ECTS and about the importance of learning outcomes, what they can do at the end of the course, the short course that they were doing with non-formal adult education providers. And these were not extensive long courses. The purpose was to give them skills that they could go out and use. So they were looking at maybe a number of weeks to a number of months, but that they had to be clear, measurable, can-do statements. And really, as I said, the importance was that learners understood what they were going to gain, but also for the providers that they were very clear as to what the purpose and intention of their training was, and ensuring that that was being very clearly communicated to those who were going to be engaging with it. And then in terms of the learner workload and estimating total effort. So that was classroom time, practice, projects, and independent learning. And I suppose for those for the cohort that people were engaging with, sometimes just the environment that they found themselves in, where they were living, their circumstances, their home lives, there was a lot of discussion around that as well, in terms of respecting the parameters of non-formal adult education, that, people can be in very precarious positions, and that in terms of the learner workload, they had to be realistic with that as well, which then forms part of the discussion about the training. And then the assessment evidence. For many, they didn't have assessment as part of their non-formal adult education courses, but then it's important that they have, say, certificates of completion which are recognizable outside of the training environment. So, what was the most appropriate, and having, appropriate evidence or of instruments that were used, are appropriate assessment methods as well, that, captured the learning of individuals, that was meaningful to the area that they were trying to achieve or demonstrate. So for some, they had created their own art displays or art projects, and because it was more the artistic kind of a display of people's achievements to that point, that was what was core. They wanted to empower the people, encourage them to share their past learning, or where they've come from, or the different cultural aspects that they and perspectives that they had. So, again, it was working in tandem with who the organizations were, who they were working with, but that, again, that you were giving something meaningful to people at the end. And some then focused very much on employability skills. So it was about, the development of the CV. So that was a practical demonstration of having achieved the skill. So again, it varied, but again, it was providing the methodologies for them to understand that this was adaptable to whatever situation or circumstance that they were engaged with. The methodology then, that the 6 steps, about knowing your learners, and I think that was very interesting part of the project, because, as I said, a lot of the learners were quite transient, so they weren't people who had a permanent residence or who were guaranteed to be here in 6 months' time in the same location, say in Italy or in Spain. So the group was quite transient, but it was about knowing your learners. What are the general kind of attributes of your learner group? What kind of have they very little formal education? There might be some who have some formal education. So are you looking at 2 different courses? So knowing your learners, estimating the EQF level, and again, for them to look at, in terms of the EQF, and why we use the EQF level is because it crosses Europe, as opposed to looking maybe at the national framework. So as a European project, to ensure the mobility of a learner and their learning. So it was used as a very much a reference point, but not that courses were being placed in any way within or aligned with the framework. But it did inform people as to, how do they position their courses, how do they describe their courses, and how they define their learning outcomes. How do you write clear, measurable, can-do statements, which they then tested through the pilots, and adapted the learning outcomes when they really didn't make sense, or they didn't actually describe exactly what was being covered, or it couldn't be measured. So I suppose typical conversations that can happen when developing curriculum. Then estimating workload, realistic workload estimations. So, and including all of the activities of individuals. So it wasn't just saying, we'll focus on what is being covered in the classroom, but also, what is the balance that's required for the learning outcomes to be achieved. For some, they felt that, for some learners, depending on where they were at and their familiarity maybe in learning, that independent study was not feasible, and so they would have adapted maybe the time as well that was spent within the classroom environment, to ensure that people were very clear and understood what was being achieved in the classroom. Then planning assessment, and again, ensuring that people weren't overwhelmed, picking practical assessment tools that ensured that the learning outcomes, that the learning was demonstrated, that it wasn't overly onerous, that you weren't over assessing, you know, that you just were, I suppose, giving them confidence as well in what they have had achieved, and using rubrics. So, you know, making people aware of what was the standard expected, what were the things that they were being required to demonstrate, and to what extent had they moved along maybe a continuum towards that, maybe where was there room for improvement. So again, positive reinforcement, positive feedback. And then the document achievement, so, you know, a certificate of completion, so that they had something. For a lot of them, for a lot of these learners, for the partners of the project, people didn't have any certificates of achievement or of completion from any part of their lives. And, you know, this was hugely important for them, that they had something physical to show somebody else, to explain exactly the skill set that they have had, the where there were further opportunities, as we said, for progression, that it was evident to, say, the next organization, institution, employer, exactly what this person could bring to the role or to the classroom. So, and why was it easy to implement? And this was very much feedback from the providers. They felt that there was ready-to-use templates, there was step-by-step guide. It wasn't to reword or redevelop the ECTS guide in any way, but it was just that they felt that they needed this toolkit to kind of bridge the process of how and where and why they would do things, that, you know, the way, I suppose, that ECTS outlines. So for them, they felt, you know, there was no need to create materials from scratch. You know, they could work on stuff that they already had, or maybe rough outlines of what they had already developed, that those templates, they could fit in the materials that they had, and then work on areas that maybe needed additional development. The other thing was that it was adaptable to context. So, as I said, the 5 providers were very, very diverse, with a very diverse learner groups. And so they found that the methodology was very flexible, and it adapted to all of their different contexts. So they could see the applicability of it for all non-formal adult education providers. And it was written very much with plain language, plain, simple language that I suppose we grappled with as a formal education provider, because we're possibly more, you know, familiar with things being written in a particular way, and the assumption that it's very understandable, but actually, you know, it was going back and paring it back to make sure that, you know, it was very much a step-by-step, written in ordinary language that could be understood by everybody within learning, non-formal learning contexts. So what the providers gained, you know, they obtained clear course descriptors. So, you know, they developed course descriptions that communicated the learning value more effectively to learners, to employers, to other education providers. They felt that, you know, it was now clearer, even to them, as to the learning that was being achieved, what was the purpose of the courses. And, you know, it was very explicit what learners would gain from undertaking one of their courses. In terms of workload estimation as well, it became more transparent and evidence-based because it was linked with the learning outcomes. You know, providers could justify the time allocated to different activities and to demonstrate the total effort required for successful completion. And again, you know, it wasn't to rush people through, but it was saying that, well, actually, we might need more time because it will take time to ensure that all learners will have gained this learning. That assessment, was mapped to outcomes. So the activities were better aligned with intended learning outcomes. And this ensured that what was assessed actually reflected what learners were supposed to learn. And it also helped providers identify gaps in their programs. So, where either they assumed it would be gained, or, either through their learning outcomes or the course content, but also maybe they weren't ensuring a comprehensive coverage of all elements. And it also improved stakeholder communication. So, it improved comparability between stakeholders in understanding and comparing learning across different contexts and providers. And that had benefit for, individuals, but also for employers and formal education institutions, that they could, more easily recognize, I suppose, the value of non-formal learning, that it wasn't being dismissed as not being appropriate or relevant. And again, this comes back to the whole area of recognition of prior learning and recognizing all forms of learning, not just the learning that has been gained within a formal context, because it has huge value for an individual, but also for formal education providers, because it enhances the learning environment for everybody. So what learners gained, I suppose, they gained clearer communication of achievements. And really, I mean, this is the core of anything that we do, is what do learners actually get from these processes and what is designed. So, they received documentation that clearly stated what they could do now. And that wasn't always the case within non-formal adult education, or the ones that we worked with. What was the effort involved? What was the workload? And the evidence of their achievement. As I said, a lot of them would not have certificates of achievement or of completion of non-formal learning. And this was hugely valuable when they were presenting their learning and their background to prospective employers or education providers. It also, I suppose, in terms of the ability to present learning, the learners were better able to present their outcomes, as I said, the workload, the evidence to support progression decisions. Why were they now pursuing maybe something different? Why were they seeking opportunities maybe in a different sector or employment sector? And I suppose the common language of ECTS, that they found it, that for their learners, that it made it easier for institutions to understand their prior learning. So feedback was also gained from the learners who engaged in this training as to what they got from it. It also boosted their confidence, and empowerment of learners is hugely important in any context. But seeing their learning described in a formal, respected way often boosted confidence and validated efforts. It supported and it encouraged them to go further. The visibility of effort, in terms of the documentation, the real effort that was invested by them in achieving this learning, and learners really valued that, because sometimes that's invisible maybe to those outside, that you have invested a lot of time and of yourself in achieving something, but that that nowhere is it written. And for these learner groups, they found that was one of the big pluses, I suppose, in undertaking this. And the last was common language. They could articulate their achievements in terms that were understood across European education systems. So to be able to describe what you've been doing and what you've achieved in terms of learning outcomes, that was something that they didn't have before. And it was very clear as to, over the X period of time that I'd invested in training, then this is what has been the key takeaways for me. As part of the project, like automatic recognition or guaranteed progression were not promised to the learners, because that, I suppose, is another step forward. But it, you know, again, it for the non-formal adult education providers, you know, this methodology was something new to them as well for many of them and many people within their organizations. And so that they weren't kind of trying to run before they learned how to walk in terms of describing what the learning that was being achieved or the intentions of their training, etc. But it did support learners in better evidencing their learning where recognition routes existed. So, you know, again, they were armed with the information in a language that was possibly clearer to those they were speaking to. So for a lot of them, they used existing courses, and they completed the learner profile, they estimated the workload, they mapped the assessment evidence, and you know, this was the step-by-step approach that all of the providers used, and they would recommend like using the templates. I think having that step-by-step guide for them was hugely beneficial. And this is the non-formal adult education guide. It's available through the website. It's available in 5 languages, and it has the worksheets, and it also has the case studies from the pilots and the learning from the providers in what they felt were the core takeaways or the process that they went through through the project. So I have a QR code here, and if you could give feedback on this presentation, but also broadly on the project and the outcomes, really appreciate it. And I suppose if anyone has any questions, I'd gladly take them now, or comments or reflections. So I will hand it over to you. So, Andrina, do you have a question or a comment?
I think it's very exciting, Deirdre. I really do. I'm intrigued by the estimating of the EQF levels. How easy was that to communicate? And, you know, how did people arrive at that? But I'm also, all I can see are the opportunities here. And I'm thinking of things like the EQPR, you know, the European Qualifications Passport for Refugees. I think I could see lots of ways. I can think of so many people who'd be really interested in this, working with groups who are migrant, who basically have a lot of mobility for various reasons. But I also think, listening to your conversations, I don't think there are huge differences between the groups that you worked with across the different jurisdictions and what happens in community ed here, you know, where programs evolve based on the needs of the group you've got in front of you, and where actually, you know, very small groups of people may have very particular focus in their learning. I don't know what you think, Patsy, or anybody else on the call, but do you know, where programs can be very, very specifically tailored based on an ambition. And I think that this is a very helpful way of making the learning visible. I think, you know, I really like what I've heard. I think, you know, I'd like to see more of this.
Yeah, and estimating the level, Andrina, actually was quite challenging in terms of where the starting point was, right? But also the end point actually was very challenging as well, because so the groups can be very, very diverse, right? So and I suppose the one thing we were very conscious of was not upsetting the great work of non-formal adult education providers, you know, be it community education, like what they're doing and who they're engaging with, that there is a function and a purpose to that beyond formal education. And so you don't want to be kind of, I suppose, ring fencing people in, but for them to kind of say like generally who they are. And they, to be fair, they were very good at looking at the starting point or the baseline of groups, and and then being clear of, well, some groups might be at EQF level 1 and some people might be at EQF level 2. But then when you're also developing the course, that you're not saying that people at EQF level 1 should now be aiming for courses at EQF level 3. And that what are the implications of that? And that, again, the internal challenge of like an EQF level 3 course might be more useful to them in terms of progression and opportunities in employment or in further education. But actually their abilities aren't at EQF level 3. And if we take that leap, then that has implications because they will need more support. And it takes, and so they're trying to bridge then those two levels, for instance. And again, there was huge understanding around that area. That you meet people at the level that they're at the moment, but also you have to ensure that you're supporting people to succeed and not creating overly ambitious points or reference points for them. So but it, as you said, and for these providers, it was a huge departure for them in not kind of designing, redesigning, readapting every single time. And so that when they were saying, oh, it's an introduction to IT, but they hadn't taken account of who are the learners, what are their, what's the starting point, where they're trying to get to, that what does introduction to IT mean then? So if you happen to be in a group that has a higher EQF level starting point, then that's going to be maybe a higher course than someone else who's starting at EQF level 1. And that's fine if you have the courses at multiple levels, and that's absolutely fine. But, again, it was just teasing all of that out. Really, really useful,
And then how does it tie on to the credits you achieve? How many, and
and how many learner effort hours. And we weren't saying this now equates to ECTS, but awareness about, well, in ECTS it is, and, again, that awareness of when you're looking at formal education, then there are kind of benchmarks in terms of the amount of hours of effort. And so, again, managing expectations, again, but not, the intention wasn't to restructure anything that was being done. It was to, again, that visibility of the learning that has been achieved within the non-formal context. So, and for the learners, really for the learners so that they have something that is more understandable, more visible, it's structured, it's designed, and people are very clear as to what they're undertaking from the outset. And that wasn't always the case. So, but yeah, thanks a million for the comments, Andrina.
Deirdre, thanks a million. It was great to see that because I've been hearing about it for so long as well. It was lovely to see that all summarised together. I'm looking forward to having a look at the pack and the toolkit when it's done. The bit that piqued my interest as well was the estimated workload, because that can always be a challenge for non-formal and informal learning, because we're used to creating, say, designing modules, looking at the FET credits, looking at, so say FET credits in our case, and looking at the amount of learner effort hours. But for anything to do with non-formal and informal learning, that's harder to put down on paper. So one of the first questions you usually get from people coming in through that door is kind of, how long is this going to take me? And you're going, well, you know, it depends. Everybody's individual. It might take some people 3 weeks. It might take some people 6 weeks. And, you know, and if you could put in X amount of hours per week, but I like the idea of breaking it down and kind of really quantifying that. I saw in one of the slides you had, was it a workload calculator?
Yeah,
Is that a tool for the learners themselves, or is it to
no,
help
it's
them, or
for
is
the
that for the
providers.
for the
It's for
providers?
providers, yeah. So I suppose a lot of these people, Patsy, have huge experience with working with these learner groups and these individuals. But like I didn't touch on it in the presentation, but very conscious about their living circumstances, their for outside of education, so their
Yeah.
personal circumstances, where they were, maybe that they're sharing a room with 5 people, maybe they're in a hostel, maybe they're in non or in temporary accommodation. So and that actually was a really interesting, I suppose, discussion as well, because you know for the providers that we were engaging with, because of the people that they were working with, that they were trying to, it was the real one step up, getting people moved out of maybe their social circumstance and bringing them to another, giving them opportunity to go for to the next level. And so they were, when it came to estimating the workload, there was a lot of, discussion over and back about, well, they can't do they're really not going to be able to become independent learners or do independent learning because they don't have access to this, they don't have access to that, they don't have an environment where they can study. And so it was, and then it was like, well, okay, go back to the learning outcomes. So how long is it going to take them to achieve those learning outcomes? What is more realistic? So if they don't have the circumstances where they can do independent learning, or maybe they're not at the level where the independent learning is realistic, then it's more classroom learning. So you have to be realistic in what you're doing. But they literally looked at, especially following the pilots, what was realistic. A lot of them kind of felt, are the independent learning, that some of them felt that like you were leaving them off into the wilds and they would do it themselves. But like you can have it very focused on what they're doing, working in a project, a group project, doing something, group presentation, a skills demonstration, whatever it was. So, but they literally broke down absolutely every single thing and looked at who are their learners, how long did it really take them, were they underestimating the time that it actually took to ensure that they had the grasp of what they needed to grasp. So it was actually fascinating, when you're, because it's in a different context,
Completely different,
completely, and you have to respect the parameters of where people are, and even though you kind of say, well, it doesn't affect, but it does hugely affect their ability to achieve or to complete the learning. So and
Deirdre,
successfully.
when you started, like, did it take you a while to kind of grapple, to get used to that context? Did it feel very,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Because I mean, it's total foreign context for us, and I suppose when you look at ECTS, you can kind of think like, but what's the problem? This is very clear, and this is very easy. But it's only easy because of familiarity. So if you're not familiar, and even with different learners and their situations, and that it's not just who presents to you in a classroom or comes to your center, it's everything else that they bring with them, and like it's that everything else that they bring with them that has a massive impact on them and their ability to commit to turning up to class or to be present, like in the case of the Italian partner, like people weren't guaranteed that they would be in a particular, say, refugee centre for X amount of time. So it was quite transient. So people were moving around. That has a huge impact on what you're doing. So like there was huge learning on our part, Patsy, as to understanding the context, understanding, you know, the challenges beyond just writing learning outcomes. And but also, you know, making clear what your design, you know, making it clear and explicit exactly what is the purpose of the education that you're doing, you know, and sometimes maybe we don't always pause and think of that, you know, even as formal education, but it was a massive learning curve for us. And because they were all so different, like some were working with children. I mean, it was like an orphanage, but they wouldn't call them orphanages anymore. And so, you know, they had younger learners, but some adults connected with that. You know, those who are kind of becoming adults are being classified as adults, so they'd be moving out of that kind of residential situation. And then you had the, you know, the migrants, refugees, those who were very socioeconomically disadvantaged, fringes of society, you know, challenges with, you know, within the legal systems, the structure, like massive, you know, but you know, it really was about creating something very positive so that you are building and valuing the person and their learning and providing them opportunities. So
isn't it great when you do a project and you learn as much from it as you bring to the table, when you maybe don't expect to get as much out of something as you kind of think you're bringing your own knowledge to a project, and then you realize, wow, I've actually learned more than I've brought to this sometimes, you know. It's amazing.
Yeah. No, it is. It's, you know, it's a fantastic opportunity really to get that perspective, and it kind of stops you in the tracks and look at what you're doing and how you're doing it. And, you know, but also when we talk about RPL, Patsy, right? Or our favorite topic.
Our favorite topic.
But when you look at
now we're so
RPL
confused. Come on.
and you say informal and non-formal learning, we value that. But, you know, okay, well, what does that mean? And looking at the non-formal learning and, you know, making sure that, like, when you're looking at non-formal learning, especially from the non-formal adult education sector, that like it is, you know, that, well, what does that mean? You know, how do we ensure that we're getting the right information, you know, so that it is transferable? And that's what these providers wanted. They wanted to, I suppose, harness that opportunity so that, like, when you say that all learning is valued, all prior learning is valued, that it's in a structure that is more readily recognizable than, say, something that is, you know, 3-line descriptor or whatever. Like, they know that it needed to be a bit more explicit as to what they were doing in terms of their program design. So yeah, it was, you know, as you said, great to do a project and you get more out of it yourself as well and unintended learning that you couldn't have foreseen.
You'll have to be RPL'd for that, Deirdre.
Exactly. Yeah.
All that unintentional learning.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
what I love though,